I still remember the smell of the coffee I was drinking when my entire life collapsed. It was a Tuesday. Ordinary, unremarkable. The kind of Tuesday that exists only to connect more important days together. I was sitting at our kitchen table, mine and Ryan's kitchen table, going through wedding venue invoices with a highlighter in one hand and a mug of dark roast in the other. 4 months. We had 4 months until the wedding, and I was deep in the beautiful chaos of finalizing everything. The centerpieces, the seating chart, the dress that needed its second fitting next week. Ryan walked in through the front door later than usual, and the moment I looked up at him, something shifted in the air. It was subtle. The way his shoulders were carrying something invisible. The way he wouldn't quite meet my eyes when he said, "Hey." I said, "Hey, you're late. I've been going through the florist invoices. Did you know they quoted us $200 more than the original estimate? I swear these people think we're made of." He said, "Emma, stop." I looked at him. Really looked at him. And I knew. I didn't know what I knew. But I knew something was coming that would require me to set down my coffee. So I did. I set it down slowly, and I folded my hands on top of the invoice papers, and I said, very quietly, "What did you do?" Ryan ran his hand through his hair. That nervous gesture I had watched him do for 3 years. The one that used to be endearing, and he sat down across from me. Not next to me. Across from me. The full width of the table between us. And then he said words that I will hear in my sleep for the rest of my life. He said, "It's Sarah." I stared at him. "Emma, I'm sorry. I didn't plan for this to happen. We don't." My voice came out so calm it scared me. "Don't you dare say we. Say what you did." He swallowed. "Sarah and I have been. We've been seeing each other for about 8 months." And he stopped. He actually stopped there, as though the pause would somehow cushion what came next. "She's pregnant." The kitchen was very quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming. I could hear a car passing outside. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and furious, like a war drum that hadn't yet signaled the charge. 8 months. 8 months while I was choosing napkin colors and writing vows and telling my friends that Ryan was the one. 8 months of sleeping beside this man, of cooking dinners and laughing at inside jokes and building the architecture of a shared future, and the entire time, he was walking into my sister's arms. My sister, Sarah, 35 years old. My older sister, the woman who sat beside me at our grandmother's funeral and held my hand. The woman who helped me pick out my engagement ring setting when Ryan asked for my opinion on cuts and carrots. My sister who had called me 2 months ago to say how excited she was to be a bridesmaid. I said, "Get out of my house." Ryan blinked. "Emma, this is my house." My voice didn't shake. I was proud of that. Later in the shower, I would shake so hard I had to sit down on the tile floor. But not then. "My name is on the lease. Get out, tonight. Can we just talk about this? I know it's a shock, but I need you to understand that this wasn't something I ever wanted to." I said get out. I stood up. I was 5'4" and wearing a cardigan with a coffee stain on the sleeve, and I have never felt more terrifying in my life. "Get your things and leave, Ryan. And don't you dare call me until I tell you to." He left. I sat back down at the kitchen table. I looked at the wedding invoices, and then I picked up my phone and called my mother. That was my first mistake. Not the biggest one, but the first. My mother answered on the second ring, her voice warm and distracted the way it always was. And I said, "Mom, I need you to come over. Something happened." She was at my door within 20 minutes, my father trailing behind her with his coat half buttoned and his reading glasses still on his head. I let them in. I sat them down, and with all the composure I could gather, I told them exactly what Ryan had told me. My mother's face went through 5 different expressions in the span of 30 seconds. I watched them all: shock, confusion, something that looked almost like recognition, as though this wasn't entirely surprising to her, which I filed away in the back of my mind for later. And then, finally, something settled over her features that I can only describe as a kind of terrible resolve. She said, "Emma, sweetheart." "Don't," I said. "Don't sweetheart me right now. I need you to be my mother first." My father cleared his throat. He said, "This is a very difficult situation." "For me," I said, It's a very difficult situation for me. I'm the one whose fiancé slept with my sister. For everyone, my father said, and I felt something cold move through my chest. My mother reached across and put her hand over mine. Her rings were cool against my knuckles. She said, "You have to understand. Sarah is 35, her options." I pulled my hand back. "Excuse me?" My mother pressed on, her voice taking on that particular tone she uses when she has already made a decision and is merely presenting it as a conversation. "Sarah has been struggling, Emma. You know that. She's always wanted a family. At her age, the window is—" "The window," I repeated. "Biologically speaking—" "Mom?" I stood up. "Are you sitting in my home? The home where I have been planning my wedding for the last year and telling me that my sister's biological clock is the relevant issue right now?" "You're 27, my father said. "You have time, Emma. You'll find someone—" The laugh that came out of me wasn't a laugh at all. It was something harder and more jagged. The kind of sound a person makes when the absurdity of a situation exceeds the capacity of normal human responses. "I'm not asking you to help me find someone," I said. "I'm asking you to acknowledge that your other daughter did something unforgivable. That's all. I'm not asking for a verdict. I'm not asking you to disown anyone. I am asking you to look me in the eye and tell me that what Sarah did was wrong." My parents looked at each other. That look lasted no more than 2 seconds. But I have replayed it thousands of times since, because in those 2 seconds I understood something that no daughter should ever have to understand about her parents, that their love had always had a hierarchy, and I had always been second. My mother said, "Families get through hard things. Emma, if you could just be a little—" I opened the front door. I said goodnight. They chose her. I want you to understand what that phrase actually means, because it is very easy to read it and absorb it as a fact and move on. So let me make it concrete. Within 2 weeks of Ryan's confession, my parents had welcomed him into family dinners at Sarah's house. My aunts were already knitting yellow baby blankets. My cousin, who had been in my wedding party, who had stood in my kitchen 6 weeks earlier and told me she wanted to give a toast about how Ryan and I were the most solid couple she'd ever seen, posted a photograph of herself with her arm around Sarah's barely showing stomach, captioned, "So excited for this new chapter," with a heart emoji. I was not in any of the photographs. I had become a ghost. Worse than a ghost. Ghosts are still acknowledged. I had been edited out. A quiet, collective decision had been made that the cleanest way to handle my inconvenient devastation was to simply proceed without me. The wedding, my wedding, the one I had spent 14 months planning, was canceled. My venue deposit was not returned. Ryan did not offer to cover it. My parents did not suggest he should. Sarah texted me on a Thursday afternoon. Just once. The message was so extraordinary in its cruelty that I have to share it word for word. She wrote, "Emma, I know you're hurting, but maybe this happened for a reason. Ryan and I have something real. Maybe he realized he needed a real woman. I hope you can find peace with that someday. You're still young." I read that message 4 times. Then I took a screenshot. Then I blocked her number. People often ask me, when I tell this story, why I didn't immediately explode. Why I didn't drive to Sarah's house and say every vicious thing that was living behind my teeth. Why I didn't send a mass family email. Why I didn't make a scene. Here is my answer, because Sarah wanted me to. I knew my sister. I had known her for 27 years. Long enough to understand her particular brand of winning. Sarah did not just want the prize. Sarah wanted the surrender. She wanted me broken and screaming and discredited. Because a screaming, broken Emma was an Emma that the family could dismiss. A hysterical Emma was not a credible Emma. A hysterical Emma was just a jealous little sister who couldn't handle losing. I was not going to give her that. So instead, I did something that took far more discipline than screaming. I went quiet. I went gray. I withdrew from the family completely, block by block, like dismantling a building from the inside, and I let them think they had beaten me. I moved into a smaller apartment. I went back to work. I threw myself into my career with a focused fury that my colleagues described as impressive and that I knew was actually survival. I worked late. I ran in the mornings. I rebuilt myself into someone harder and quieter and infinitely more patient. And I watched, from a distance, I watched my family perform their happiness. I watched the baby shower photos appear on my cousin's Instagram pastel balloons. A tiered cake, my mother laughing with Sarah's friends. I watched the gender reveal a girl. I watched Ryan standing in photographs with his hand on Sarah's stomach, smiling the smile of a man who had convinced himself that what he had done was romantic rather than catastrophic. I watched and I waited and I did not make a single move until the message arrived. It came on a Sunday night, 10 months after Ryan's confession. An anonymous message through Instagram. No profile picture. A username made of random numbers. The message said only you should know the truth. I'm sorry this is happening to you. Attached were screenshots. I sat with my phone in both hands for a long time before I opened them. My first instinct was that this was a trap that Sarah, always theatrical, had orchestrated some kind of false evidence to draw me out of my silence and into a reaction she could use against me. So I breathed. I made myself tea. I sat down at my kitchen table, my new, smaller kitchen table, and I opened the attachments with the deliberate calm of someone diffusing something. The screenshots were conversations. Text messages between Sarah and a man I didn't recognize. They were dated and the dates overlapped, precisely and damningly, with the timeline of Sarah's pregnancy. The messages were not ambiguous. I set my tea down. I opened my laptop. I began to cross-reference dates. Ryan had told me Sarah was approximately 8 weeks pregnant when he confessed. He had confessed in the 3rd week of October. That placed conception around late August. The screenshots showed Sarah and this unknown man, first name Marcus. No last name, in a hotel together on August 14th. I made a note. Over the next 3 weeks, more messages arrived from the same anonymous account. More screenshots. A photograph taken outside what appeared to be an upscale restaurant. Sarah, in a red dress I recognized, laughing with a different man. A hotel receipt in Sarah's name, dated September 2nd, with a room registered for 2. A string of text messages, explicitly intimate, between Sarah and a third man whose contact name in her phone was simply D. 3 men, possibly 4, all within the conception window. I sat with this information for a long time. I did not feel triumph. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was something quieter and colder, the specific feeling of a puzzle clicking into a shape you suspected but hoped you were wrong about. Because the implication of what I was looking at was not simply that Sarah was unfaithful to Ryan. The implication was that Ryan might not be the father of this child. And if Ryan wasn't the father, then he had destroyed my life, my engagement, my wedding, my family relationships, my deposit on a venue, 8 months of future planning for a lie. Not even a conscious lie, necessarily. Maybe Sarah hadn't known. Maybe she had genuinely believed it was Ryan's. But maybe, and this possibility settled into me with the weight of something I could not ignore, maybe Sarah had suspected the uncertainty all along. Maybe she had chosen Ryan specifically because he was safe, stable, already attached to someone who would be easy to displace. Maybe my fiancé had been a calculated move. I stopped sleeping well. I made a decision. Her name was Patricia Holmond. She came recommended by a colleague whose divorce had been complicated enough to require exactly the kind of professional discretion Patricia specialized in. She was 60-something, compact, and had the specific energy of someone who had seen every variety of human deception and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. We met at a coffee shop near my office. I slid the folder across the table, all my compiled screenshots, dates, cross-referenced timelines, everything I'd gathered over the past month. Patricia looked through it without changing her expression. Then she looked up at me. She said, "What do you want?" I said, "The truth. All of it. I want to know who she's been seeing, for how long, and whether there is any realistic way to determine who fathered this child before the father on the birth certificate becomes legally entrenched." Patricia nodded slowly. She said, "The baby's born 4 weeks ago. Father listed Ryan." She made a note. "He signed voluntarily?" "Yes." "Immediately." I paused. "He doesn't know what I know." Patricia looked at me over the rim of her glasses with an expression I can only describe as appreciative. She said, "How long are you willing to wait?" I said, "As long as it takes." She said, "Good answer." What Patricia uncovered over the following 6 weeks was, even by my already lowered expectations, extraordinary. Sarah had been conducting simultaneous relationships with 4 men over the preceding 2 years. Not casual flirtations sustained, deliberate, overlapping entanglements. The man named Marcus, she had been seeing for 14 months. The man whose contact name was D, real name Daniel. A married architect from a neighboring suburb, she had been seeing for nearly 2 years. There were 2 others, less documented but present enough in the evidence to matter. More damning, Patricia discovered that Sarah had specifically and deliberately inserted herself into Ryan's life approximately 10 months before his confession to me. She had shown up at his gym, a gym she had never attended before, 30 minutes from her house in the opposite direction of her commute. She had engineered proximity, manufactured chance encounters. Ryan, to be fair to the depths of his own stupidity, had walked right into it. Sarah had chosen him, not because she loved him, because he was mine. I remember the night Patricia delivered her final report. I sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning reading it, and when I finally set it down, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in the dark for a very long time, thinking about jealousy. About how a person can spend 35 years wanting what someone else has with an intensity they keep so deeply buried that nobody around them ever sees it, not even the sister who grew up sleeping in the next bedroom. I thought about all the times Sarah had said, "You're so lucky, Emma." All the times she'd said, "I wish I had your life," and I had taken it as affection, as sisterly admiration. I had been so foolish. I arranged for a court-admissible DNA test. When my mother called to invite me to the christening, she framed it as an olive branch. She said, "We miss you, Emma. Whatever happened between all of us, that little girl is family. She deserves to have her aunt in her life." I had not spoken to my mother in 9 months. Her voice on the phone was careful and practiced, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this call several times. I said, "You're right. She is family." My mother exhaled. "So you'll come?" "I'll come." There was a pause. Then she said quietly, "Emma, I know we didn't handle things the way we should have. When you're ready to talk about that—" "One thing at a time, Mom," I said. "Let's start with the christening." I could hear the relief in her voice, and I had to close my eyes for a moment at the particular bitterness of it, her relief. Not at my pain being resolved, but at the inconvenience of my absence being resolved. I was returning. The family picture would be complete again. The discomfort of having exiled a daughter would dissolve. And they could tell themselves it had all worked out. They had no idea what I was walking in with. The christening was held at a church 40 minutes from my parents' house, which I had attended every Christmas and Easter for my entire childhood. I arrived on time, not early, not late. I wore a navy dress. My hair was down. I had spent the morning in a state of extraordinary stillness, the kind that only comes when you have been waiting a very long time for something, and the waiting is finally over. I walked in. Heads turned. My mother came toward me with her arms open, and I let her hug me, and I said the appropriate things. My father shook my hand. We had never been a physically demonstrative family, and said, "It's good to have you back." I nodded. Sarah was across the room holding the baby. When she saw me, something moved through her face that she disguised almost immediately with a smile. Almost. I caught it. That flicker of not guilt. Exactly. More like assessment. Like a chess player seeing an unexpected piece on the board. She walked over. She said, "Emma, I'm so glad you came." She tilted the baby toward me. "This is Lily." I looked at the baby. Lily, round-cheeked and solemn-eyed, peering at the world with the magnificent blank curiosity of the very new. She was beautiful in the specific way that all babies are beautiful, completely unaware of every catastrophic adult decision that had preceded her existence. I said, "She's beautiful." Sarah's smile tightened at its edges, like a rubber band stretched slightly too far. She had expected me to be diminished. She had expected 9 months of exile to have produced someone softer, more desperate, easier to manage. She was recalibrating. Ryan appeared at her shoulder. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen from him before, not quite guilt, not quite defiance. Something between the two. The face of a man who has made a decision he has not entirely stopped questioning. He said, "Emma, it's good to see you." I said Ryan, just his name. Nothing else. We did not hug. The ceremony began. The church smelled like candles and old wood, the way it always had. Lily was baptized by a priest who had known my family for 20 years, and she cried only briefly when the water touched her head, and then was quiet and watchful. The family filled the first 4 rows. My parents sat with Sarah and Ryan in the front. I sat in the 3rd row between my cousin, who kept glancing at me sideways with something between guilt and curiosity, and a great aunt who was partially deaf and blissfully uninvested in family politics. Afterward, the reception was held at my parents' house, long tables in the backyard. My mother had outdone herself. There were flowers and a beautiful spread of food and a cake with "Welcome" Lily written across it in pale pink icing. The afternoon light came through the oak trees in long, golden columns. Under any other circumstances, it would have been lovely. Ryan gave a speech about an hour into the reception. He stood at the head of the table with a glass of champagne, and he said all the things men say when they have decided, against the evidence of their own character, that they are good people. He said, when you meet someone who changes your life, you know it. And when Lily came into the world, everything changed. I look at her and I know that whatever happened to bring us to this moment, and here he glanced briefly at me, which was either stupid or brave, and I think it was both, was exactly what was meant to be. Everyone applauded. Sarah looked radiant. She had always been beautiful. We had different versions of the same features. Mine softer, hers more sculpted, and she was looking at Ryan with a particular expression of a woman who has gotten everything she wanted and is enjoying the savoring of it. She caught my eye across the table and gave me a small smile, the smile of a winner. I smiled back. Then I stood up. The table went quiet, because I had not been expected to speak. I had not announced that I would speak. The silence that fell was the specific silence of a group of people unsure whether to be welcoming or alarmed. I said I'd like to say something too, if that's all right. My mother's face a quick, involuntary tensing that she smoothed over instantly. Sarah's face unreadable. Ryan's face the beginning of something that was not quite fear, but was in the neighborhood. I said, I want to start by thanking everyone for the invitation today. I know my absence this past year was difficult for the family, and I appreciate being welcomed back. I paused, and I want to say that Lily is a beautiful baby, and she deserves every good thing. Nods around the table, some visible, relaxing. My mother's shoulders came down half an inch. I said, I also want to share something, because I think it's important, and because I believe this family deserves to make decisions based on truth rather than assumptions. The relaxing stopped. I reached into my bag. I had prepared 3 packets, one for my parents, one for Ryan, one for the general table. They were printed on clean white paper and stapled neatly, because if I was going to do this, I was going to do it with precision. I said, over the past several months, I hired a private investigator. I set the packets on the table. What she uncovered is documented here. Sarah has been involved with multiple men over the past 2 years, during the same period when Ryan and she became involved. At least 4 men, to be specific. The documentation includes dates, photographs, and in some cases written communications. The table was extraordinarily silent. Sarah said, her voice very controlled, Emma, what are you doing? I said, I'm sharing information that affects this family. You don't have to thank me. I reached into my bag again. The second document you'll find in each packet is a court-admissible DNA paternity test. I was able to obtain samples legally and through proper channels. I set the second documents on the table. Ryan is not Lily's biological father. There are moments in life that are so extreme in their emotion that they don't feel real while they're happening. They feel like watching something through glass. This was one of them. Ryan's face went white. Not pale. White. Like the blood had been replaced with something cold and still. And what I was looking at was the surface of a man who had just had the entire structural foundation of the last year pulled out from under him. He said, he stopped. That's not possible. I said, the lab is accredited. The chain of custody is documented. You can request an independent test. He looked at Sarah. Sarah was doing something remarkable, which was nothing. She had gone completely still. Her face had arranged itself into a blankness that I recognized, because I had seen it before years ago, when we were teenagers, and she had been caught in a lie, and she had simply refused to move. as though stillness could function as denial. Someone's aunt said, "What is happening?" My cousin said something I couldn't hear. My father said, "Ryan." Ryan said, "Sarah." His voice was very quiet, the volume of a man trying very hard to stay controlled. "Sarah, look at me." Sarah looked at him. He said, "Tell me this isn't true." She said nothing. That silence lasted 4 seconds, I counted. Then Ryan said, "Who is the father?" And his voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, and in a different moment I might have felt sorry for him. But this was not a different moment. This was the moment that had been purchased with 14 months of my life, and the careful burning of it, and so what I felt instead was something much simpler. I felt certain. Sarah stood up. Her chair scraped back against the patio stone. She said, "This is a performance. This is Emma being Emma. She can't stand that she lost, so she's manufacturing." "The documents are real," I said. "You can verify them." "You're jealous," Sarah said, and her voice had finally broken its composure. And what was underneath it was ugly and raw, the way old jealousy always is, when it finally surfaces. "You have always been jealous of me, Emma, even before Ryan. You've always—" "Sarah." The word came from my mother, very quiet, and something in my mother's voice made Sarah stop. Because my mother had the packet in her hands. She had opened it while the rest of the scene was playing out, and she was reading. Her reading glasses were on the end of her nose. Her face was doing something I had never seen my mother's face do before, a slow and terrible aging, as though each page she turned was adding a year to her expression. My father leaned over to read with her. Ryan said, "I need." He stopped. He pressed his hands flat on the table. "I need an independent test." I said, "The lab information is on the last page of the packet. You're welcome to contact them directly." He picked up the packet. He walked inside the house. The back door closed behind him. And then Sarah, my older sister, the woman who had sent me a text message telling me that perhaps Ryan had wanted a real woman, looked at me across the table with all the people who had chosen her sitting between us, and she said, "I hate you." I said, "I know." I picked up my bag. I walked around the table. I kissed my mother on the top of her head, because she was still sitting very still with the papers in her hands, and she looked like she needed someone to be kind to her, even though she hadn't earned it. I said, "Call me when you're ready." I walked out through the side gate. I drove home. I poured a glass of wine and sat in the dark for the second time since all of this began. And this time what I felt was not triumph. It was not even relief. It was the specific exhaustion that comes when you have been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and you have finally been able to set it down. Ryan's independent test came back the following week. Not his father. I heard about it through my cousin, who called me and was crying in a way she hadn't earned the right to cry. But I let her talk. She said Ryan had moved out of Sarah's house within 48 hours of the christening. She said the family was in chaos. She said Sarah had refused to say anything about the identity of the biological father, and that the men named in the investigator's report were all being contacted, and all were denying any paternity claim. I said, "How is Lily?" A pause. Then my cousin said, "She's with Sarah." I said, "Good." I meant it. My parents called me separately. My father called first, which surprised me, because my father has always operated through my mother as an intermediary for anything emotionally significant. He called on a Sunday morning and said, without preamble, we were wrong. "Emma, what we did to you was wrong." I said, "Yes." He said, "I don't know what else to say." I said, "You don't have to say anything else right now, Dad." My mother's call came 3 days later and was longer and harder. My mother has never in my memory said the words "I was wrong" in a direct, unqualified way, and she didn't quite manage it this time either. What she said was, "I should have put you first. You were my child and I let you feel abandoned, and I have to live with that." Which was not the same thing, but was, from my mother, almost as hard to say, and I accepted it for what it was. She asked if I was coming home for Christmas. I said, "I'm not sure yet." Sarah called me once, only once. I was in my office when the call came through. I had unblocked her number a few weeks earlier, some instinct telling me I should, and there was her name on my screen. I looked at it for 4 rings. Then I picked up. There was a silence on her end. Then she said, Emma. I said, Sarah. Another silence. Then she said, I'm sorry. 2 words, just that. No elaboration, no context, no explanation. Just the words dropped into the silence between us, like something she had been holding for a long time and no longer had the strength to carry. I said, I know. She said, that's all? I said, what else is there to say? Sarah, you planned it. You pursued him deliberately. I have the documentation. You knew, or suspected, that Lily might not be his. And you didn't say so, and he signed that birth certificate because you let him believe it was certain. I paused. You got what you wanted. And then it wasn't what you thought it was going to be. That's not something I can fix for you. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said very quietly, I was jealous of you. I have been since we were little. You always seemed lighter somehow. Like everything came easier. I know that probably wasn't true, but that's how it felt. I said, I know. She said, I'm sorry. I said, I know that too. We hung up. I sat at my desk for a few minutes looking out the window at the city below. Then I went back to work. The call came on a February night, 15 months after the christening. My mother, barely coherent, saying Sarah's name over and over. A car accident on the highway, ice, a truck. The kind of accident that happens in seconds and reverberates for decades. Sarah died before the ambulance arrived. I drove to the hospital anyway, because my mother needed me there, and because whatever Sarah had done, she was still my sister. And I had loved her for 27 years before she became the person who did what she did. Both things were true. They didn't cancel each other out. I sat in the waiting room with my parents, and I held my mother's hand through the worst night any of us had ever experienced. And in the morning, when the paperwork was done and the reality had settled into something solid and permanent, my father said, Lily. I said, I know, because Lily was 18 months old and her biological father had never been identified. The men from the investigation had all denied paternity and refused testing. Ryan had legally extricated himself. His voluntary acknowledgement of paternity had been legally challenged and overturned in the weeks following the DNA results. So he had no claim. He had also made it extremely clear, through his attorney, that he had no intention of claiming any. My parents were 63 and 67. They were not in poor health, but a toddler is a toddler. The family, the extended family, the aunts and cousins and family friends who had filled Sarah's baby shower and decorated the christening hall receded with impressive speed. It is extraordinary how quickly people discover that they are actually very busy when the romantic aspect of a situation has been replaced by its practical reality. Within 6 weeks, nearly everyone had found a reason to be unavailable. Then the court contacted me. I sat with it for 2 weeks. My therapist, yes, I had finally gotten a therapist, 8 months after the christening, because it turns out that being right is not the same thing as being healed. My therapist asked me to make 2 lists. The first list, every reason not to do it. The second list, what I actually felt when I thought about Lily. The first list was long. The second list had 3 items. 1, she didn't choose any of this. 2, she has no one. 3, when I looked at her at the christening, I didn't see Sarah's victory. I saw a baby who was brand new to the world and completely undefended. I called my attorney. I began the adoption process. It took 11 months. It was not easy. There were home studies and court hearings and paperwork that seemed designed to be as exhausting as possible, which I now believe is deliberate, a system-level test of whether you actually mean it. I meant it. I completed every requirement with the same focused patience I had brought to everything else in the past 2 years. On a Thursday in November at 10 in the morning, in a courtroom with beige walls and fluorescent lighting that was deeply unflattering to everyone present, a judge signed the paperwork, and Lily became mine. My mother cried. My father held my mother's hand. I sat very still for a moment in my chair, looking at the document in my hands, and I felt something move through me that I had not felt in a very long time. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was something quieter and more durable. The feeling of having found the thing you were supposed to do with a season of your life that you thought had only taken from you. I drove home with Lily in her car seat, looking at the city through the window with those round, serious eyes, and I said, We're going to be okay. You and me. She said, bah, which I chose to interpret as agreement. Years pass. That's not a metaphor. Years literally pass. And I want to tell you what they look like. Lily at 2, obsessed with dogs. Unable to correctly identify any other animal, but able to identify dogs with extraordinary accuracy at 300 yards. An excellent quality. Lily at 4, asking questions about everything, with an intensity that her preschool teacher described as remarkable, and that I recognized as a personality trait she had not gotten from Sarah and had not gotten from Ryan, and which seemed to be entirely her own. Lily at 6, reading above her grade level, preferring her books to her classmates with a selectivity that I found deeply relatable. My mother, who came over every Sunday, called her my sunshine. My father taught her chess when she was 5 and claimed she beat him by 6, which I'm 60% certain he staged, but which Lily believed entirely, and that belief suited her beautifully. I dated, eventually. Slowly and carefully, and with a discernment I had lacked at 27. I made better choices. I did not make them quickly. My career flourished in the way careers do when you pour yourself into them with genuine passion rather than distraction. I was promoted. I bought a house, a real house, with a yard, in a neighborhood with good schools. Lily got a dog. His name was Bernard, and he was catastrophically large for a domestic animal, and she loved him in the total, uncomplicated way that children love animals. Bernard loved her back with equal totality, as dogs do. This was our life. Ryan tried. I want to give him that, or rather, I want to state it as a fact, because I have no particular interest in either vilifying or redeeming him. Ryan, approximately 4 years after the christening, reached out, through my mother first, then through a mutual acquaintance, then finally directly. An email that was 8 paragraphs long and contained the word sorry 11 times and the phrase I know I don't deserve 6 times. He said he wanted to be in Lily's life. He said he knew he had no legal claim. He said he felt responsible, not biologically but, and I had to read this line twice karmically. I asked Lily when she was 7, in a conversation that I had thought about very carefully, whether she had ever wondered about the people who had known her before she was mine. Lily, who was eating cereal and reading a picture book simultaneously, said, "You mean Sarah and Ryan?" I said yes. She said my friend Madison has a mom who's her birth mom and a mom who takes care of her. She says they're different kinds of mom. I said that's a smart way to think about it. Lily said, "What were they like?" I said Sarah was complicated. She was your mother and she loved you. She also made some mistakes. Ryan was someone who was in Sarah's life for a while and made his own mistakes. She nodded. She went back to her cereal and her book. She was 9 when she found out more not from me, but from a school project about family history that led to questions I answered honestly and age-appropriately, and from the particular cruelty of the internet, which has no concept of what a child should or should not discover about their origins. She came to me one evening with her laptop and a very still face and said, "I read some things." I said, "What things?" She said about Ryan and about Sarah, about what happened before I was born. I sat down next to her. I said, "What do you want to know?" She said, "Did Ryan love me?" I said very carefully, "I think Ryan loved the idea of you." Whether he loved you, the actual you, the you who exists right now, who reads 3 books at a time and beats grandpa at chess, that's harder to answer. He left before you had a chance to be someone he could know. She said, "He wants to see me." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't want to." I said, "Okay." She said, "Is that okay?" I said, "It's your life, Lily. I will support whatever you decide." She chose not to see him. Not because I told her to. Because she had read enough, understood enough, felt enough in her own small and formidable interior to know that a man who walked away from a baby deserved to work considerably harder than an email to earn her time. And so Ryan, who had once stood at a christening podium and spoken about destiny and belonging, was left to watch, from the outside, as the child he had walked away from grew into someone extraordinary. Every birthday photograph on my social media, every school achievement, every ordinary, mundane, luminous evidence of a life being well lived. Every time he saw it, he was reminded. Every time he saw Lily choosing us, choosing our Sundays and our chess games and our catastrophically large dog named Bernard over whatever he was offering. He carried the specific weight of a man who had been given something irreplaceable and had handed it back because he wasn't paying enough attention to recognize what it was. That was his punishment. Not a dramatic one, not a loud one, the kind that doesn't make noise, the kind that lives in the quiet moments, Sunday mornings, birthday parties, a child's laugh through a phone screen when a person is forced to confront the permanent arithmetic of what they chose versus what they could have had. The cruelest revenge is not taking something from someone.